Do you remember when you were in school, or maybe some of our young people here this morning have heard this recently, but do you remember when the teacher would tell you to look for context clues? In order to figure out the definition of an unknown word, you were supposed to pay attention to the words and the sentences in and around that one word in order to determine what it might mean. I can still hear my 7th grade teacher's condescending voice when she said, "Use the context clues, class," as we struggled through a new vocab word in The Giver. Well, with all this in mind, let me teach you a fun game you can play in church using context clues. If you ever find yourself arriving a little early to a worship service on a Sunday morning, and you're wondering to yourself, what will the sermon be about today? Well, all you need to do is look for the clues. Open up that bulletin and look at the hymns, look at the prayers, look at the readings. For example, today you'll notice that our opening hymn was "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." And our next hymn that we'll sing after this sermon is "We Give Thee But Thine Own." And our closing hymn is "Let Talents and Tongues Employ." So we've got a song about blessings, and a song about giving, and a song about talents. Do you spot the pattern? Do you see what the context clues are telling you? That's right, this is a stewardship sermon. If you had known and been wise enough to spot the clues ahead of time, you could have made your way for the door already. But now I'm afraid it's a bit too late for that. And I think you should stay, because stewardship, though it makes us uncomfortable, it really is an essential element of our faith and our lives. Before I get to all that, let's start with the obvious. Stewardship makes us uncomfortable. We don't like to talk about money in church, do we? Our lives seem to be this endless cycle of earning and spending and saving, and maybe it just feels like church should be a place that's an escape from all of that. Or maybe how we spend our money is something that we're a little embarrassed about, because we know we don't always do it wisely. And so it just feels too personal to have someone talking to us about how our money is used. And so it just makes us feel like this is an excuse to stir up a sense of guilt or embarrassment. I get it. I know what it's like to sit and listen to a stewardship sermon, because I have to do it once a year when Pastor Gary and Deacon Deborah preach on it. But I've also been in the pews before I became a pastor at churches where they would talk about this important topic. And I didn't like it much then either. I remember one year, my church put out this graph that had all these tiers to it. And it showed how many people in the church gave at each specific tier. So it was something like 50 people give between $0 and $500 a year, and 40 people give between $500 and $1,000, and 30 people give between $1,000 and $1,500, and it went on from there. And I remember when I looked at that graph, I immediately felt like this was now a competition. I wanted to move up to the next tier, but I was a kid. I wasn't even on the graph. I had no job. I only had a $2 a week allowance, so it really wasn't up to me to be able to change the tier. So I did the next logical thing, and I told my parents that they needed to beat out the other members of the church and move up a level. You see, this is so often the problem, though, with our approach to stewardship and giving. We assume that generosity is about outperforming others or about managing our guilt, when what stewardship is really about is responding to God's grace that we know in our lives. In our gospel lesson today, we see this human tendency playing out again with John the Baptist's disciples. They were upset that Jesus' disciples were also baptizing in that same region. They were afraid that Jesus was stealing their influence on the crowds. They were seeing their ministry as a competition. But thankfully, John redirects his foolish disciples. He tells them later on in the scriptures, he'll tell them, "I must decrease, but Jesus must increase." Because for John, it was never about ego. He understood his role in this story. His job was to prepare the way, not cling to power. And that's the thing about stewardship, isn't it? Our discomfort isn't really just about the money, it's about the control that money allows us. We live in a world that constantly tells us to hold on to what is ours, to compete for resources, to secure our future before worrying about others. And so when a pastor comes along and tells you that giving is a spiritual matter, that it's good for your soul to offer greater generosity, when that happens, there's probably always a part of us that just wants to lash out and fight back. We don't want to be told where to spend or where to give money because we want to maintain the power and control that money affords us. And when we're honest like this and truly self-reflective about all of this internal struggle with money and control, it also becomes quite clear that where our discomfort really stems from is an inability to trust. Do we trust that God is truly the source of all we have? Do we trust that God has provided for us and will provide again? Or do we believe deep down inside that it's always been just up to us to secure our future? Do we believe deep down inside that ultimately we really are just left all on our own? I think giving actually provides us with the opportunity to break out of this mindset. Because giving connects us to others, and it connects us to the organizations that we support. We actually read about this phenomenon in the reading from Romans that Michelle shared with us. We're told that the Apostle Paul is bringing money from churches in Greece to Christians in Jerusalem, not to just support the ministry there, but to create a connection, a sense of unity between the Greek Christians and the Jewish Christians who were at odds so often in those days. Through giving, we're forced to let go of the idea that it's all up to us. Through our giving here at Bethany Lutheran Church, we collectively support a ministry that serves the faith lives of hundreds of people every single week. Through giving collectively, we have raised thousands of dollars for world hunger. We've supported dozens of organizations throughout our city and throughout the world. We have cared for families in their joy at weddings. We've cared for families in their grief at funerals. We've continued to be a beacon sharing the life-giving message of Jesus Christ to a world that needs to hear it. You see, our giving helps us discover the context clues that seem to suggest that we're a part of something much bigger than just ourselves. Our giving connects us with the joy of being part of the family of God, where people are not dealt with by competition or scarcity, rather they're dealt with by grace and abundance. Think about it. The entire Bible is filled with story upon story about a God who gives. God creates the world and gives it to humankind to care for. God gives Abraham a promise that will be counted on for millennia. God gives the Hebrews their freedom from slavery in Egypt. God gives the Israelites the promised land. God gives the nation of Israel judges and prophets and kings as leaders and guides. And of course, God gives his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. You see, we believe in a God who has never hoarded blessings. And we see that, of course, again through this Son who was given to us. Jesus gave his life so that our broken trust in God could be restored. Because on the cross, God's generosity overwhelms our fear of not having enough. On the cross, Jesus gives everything so we no longer fear losing anything. And then, of course, at Jesus' empty tomb, we are assured again that God's provisions will never run dry. And so our call, given this abundant promise from God, is to take note of the context clues in our own life. Look out and notice how God has authored life and love for you, and then respond to this ongoing gift of love with joyful gifts of your own. We are called to care for a hurting and sinful world that we ourselves are a part of, that has never stopped God's gift to us. And so then in response to this grace, we share our gifts with those in need. Amen.